All right, let's dig in. You ready to do it?
Yep, let's do it.
Well, Mr. slash Dr. Chuck Ruby, welcome back to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
I feel like it's a much different environment. Last time I don't think I knew you at all. Now I feel like I know you. It's a completely different vibe.
Well, we're talking to each other now too. We're not
Yeah.
just listening to each other in these disembodied voices, and
Yeah.
it does help quite a bit, I think. Right?
Actually, Chuck, you know what? You're the perfect person to ask this. I've been thinking about this for a while. I kind of like audio only better. And I think I have a theory on why that is, but I'm curious in your opinion. It goes along. It goes into what we're talking about to some extent. When there's a video component, more so with people I don't know, a little, obviously less with you. I feel like I have to focus on two things as opposed to one. When it's just audio, and I remember this, I did it for 9 years. I would just kick back, often close my eyes, and I would live out this conversation in my mind. And it would allow me to see things in a more almost 4D kind of area. Where with the visual component, I'm increasingly aware of how I look, how they look, their facial, expressions, mine, what they mean. And at times I feel like it pulls away from my ability to focus on exactly what we're discussing.
hmm
What what is that? I mean, how many people do you think are their lives are modified by the senses that they have and the way they feel they should, come off and seem to others using those senses?
I imagine a bit over 8 billion people.
Yeah.
I just think this is, there's safety in anonymity, and the less modalities we have access to, the more anonymous we feel. So if you like this environment here, we can see each other, we can hear each other. I can see your hair, and I can make private comments about, oh my gosh, and you know that, and
Right.
you're concerned about my judgment of you, and I'm concerned about your judgment of me.
Hmm.
That does take up more bandwidth. But if we were to go to the other end of the spectrum and we're just writing emails back and forth, there's none of that. It's completely almost anonymous, but it's anonymous in a way that it's hard for you to judge me other than from my written words. So as we get higher on the number of sensory modalities, we have more and more reasons to be concerned about being judged, which is something that everyone is concerned about.
A lot of that does lead into what I want to talk about today, which is just comfort in dealing with emotions and discomfort. Because when you sit back and think about what we just talked about, all it is two people having a conversation. What is it about the human experience, and potentially more my mind than some others, that puts added weight and analysis behind what is happening and how others are judging us and what we feel? And it can often be uncomfortable feelings, and therefore we avoid them.
Well, we are affiliative creatures, so we're mammals basically, right? And if you notice, if you look at it from an evolutionary standpoint, when mammals came on the scene, they started taking care of their young. They didn't just lay eggs and leave.
Mm.
And the young stayed with the adults longer before they were independent and moving out on their own. And I think that just reflects this desire we have, this great desire we have to be with others and to be accepted with others, to affiliate.
Mm.
And so with that, and there's a lot of comfort in that, but with that comfort, there's a price. And the price is maybe you aren't accepted. And I think it's just ingrained in us. It's a tacit rule or assumption that we live by, where we really desire a lot to be liked, to be accepted, to be welcomed, to be part of the group. And it's terrifying to think of the possibility that we aren't going to be welcomed. And
Mm.
that's what we feel. We feel that fear, that shame. I mean, it's like a mixture of fear and shame about myself and whether I'm good enough to be with you, and whether I'm good enough to be part of the group and therefore be protected, to be
Mm.
secure in a sense,
Yeah.
right? When an infant comes on the scene, that's the big challenge, is to form an attachment. And sometimes that doesn't happen because of how the parents or the environment interfere with the parent's willingness to affiliate with the infant, to connect, to look in their eyes, to respond, to smile, to comfort. All of that teaches the infant that they're accepted. And in some situations that doesn't happen, and the infant grows up into an adult who feels very insecure, very antisocial, very asocial. They don't get that experience and that sense that I'm accepted, so I must be good enough.
I don't think hardly anybody gets that, even the ones raised right. I don't know. I feel like it's a product of today. And something you said makes me wonder if society is perpetuating that. You mentioned emails. I've thought a lot about this with the pandemic. The more people I've talked to, the more people I've watched on YouTube or TikTok or whatever talk about, I never want to go back to the office because I don't want to interact with those people, or the pandemic has taught me how to enjoy myself more, or all these things. It's a very, in my mind, it's a double-edged sword that I've thought a lot about. Is that a good thing, or are we continually trying to find comfort by ignoring discomfort, which could be other people's judgment? As simple as that.
Right. Yeah, the pandemic experience has taught us a lot. Everything from business operations, profitability in business, to interpersonal issues like this. I know within the psychotherapy field, it taught me something. When we started this distance teletherapy, I was kicking and screaming going into it. I didn't think it was going to be sufficient to actually do the kind of work we do in person. But I was surprised at how well we can assess another, we can connect with another this way that we're doing right now. It's not the same as being in person. There's definitely the case, and there's things that are missing when you're not in person. There's just a different ambiance of the process. But the same thing with this. There's a different ambiance here that you don't get in person. No, for instance, you can see into my home. I can't see into yours because you got a backdrop there.
Yeah.
But with therapy, it's the same way. I can see into their home, they can see into mine. It adds this connectivity that isn't there when you're in a sterile office face to
Right.
face. But it
Yeah.
does not have the connection that you do have when you're in person. So yeah, I think it's this issue of what do we do about technological advances? Are they bad or are they good? I think they're both. There's benefits and there's prices to pay. I think I've told you before, maybe in the previous podcast, my great-grandmother, who was born in 1868, complained about the telephone. And when it was created, that she thought the telephone was going to be the downfall of civilization because people weren't going to be personable anymore. They were just going to pick up this machine and not walk down the lane to talk to the neighbor, right? But what's funny is now we have it reversed a bit. People, she was complaining people wouldn't write letters, wouldn't go in person with others to visit them. Now people are complaining that we write letters, emails, and we don't pick up the phone to talk to people. They see it as the opposite. It's more personable to talk on the phone with someone. I don't think either one's any more personable. It's just it's a dragging our feet into new technological advances that are here to stay. And the question is, how do we take advantage of them, and what costs are we willing to pay, and how do we manage how we use them?
Yeah.
And for psychotherapy, that's the issue. How do we manage that?
I think that is the point, the management piece, because I do worry that we're really going towards the matrix. Like the more and more we, bring our experiences online, the less reason there is to leave. So it used to be, right, the world was shrunk to your house and your office and maybe a couple of bars or whatever hobbies you do, right? And now it's shrunk, okay, no longer the office. So that was 50% of your time. And then we'll get VR and all this, and it just keeps shrinking. I mean, I bought one of the reasons we bought this house was because I wanted the office that it has, and now I'm sick of it because I've spent so much time in it over the past 2 years. So what happens with that, you know?
Right, it's
I
a
don't know.
challenge. Maybe the answer is unknown. It's just we are going into this blind in a way, and we'll figure it out as we go. It's
Yeah.
kind of like that with personal emotional problems. There's a sense of I call it faith. Some people don't like that word, and by no means do I mean just a religious faith, but some kind of faith in going into the world blind in a way. We don't see everything. There are blind spots, but if we can develop a sense that we'll make it, no matter what happens. So we prepare, but at some point we just stop and play the game. And if we have this sense of faith that we'll make it no matter what happens, that's key in coming up with some sense of contentment in life.
Yeah. Well,
A lot of people, unfortunately, try to know for sure, and that's where they fall on their faces because you can't. But they keep trying and they keep trying, and we call it anxiety. And we
I
call
was
it,
just about to say, would those people happen to be the anxious ones? Because I feel like you're describing me to an extent. Well, look, that's what I want to get into. So, first of all, welcome back to the show. I wanted to ask you this. I think, I don't know if you know this. Our listeners probably don't. We last spoke, it was October of 2019. And that episode is now the second most downloaded episode in the history of our podcast,
Wow.
which I find so fascinating. That the only person ahead of you is Brene Brown. Her episode's been running for like 9 years at this point. And I find it interesting because at the time, you didn't even have a book. I don't even know if you had a website. What do you think it is about this topic of the realities of mental illness that draws so much attention?
I don't know. I'm hoping that it is well, to the extent that people tuned in to listen to the podcast, they may have heard of this viewpoint before and wanted to know more about it, because the viewpoint that I present is a freeing, enabling kind of a viewpoint, and it helps us get around the problem of mental illness by seeing it as an illusion. And perhaps that's what drew people to this, because frankly, I think everyone listening now, you and I together, everyone in the world has a mental illness. The definition of mental illness is so broad and so ambiguous that I could, depending on how I interview you, I can tag you with a diagnosis. Excuse me. All that means is that this concept of mental illness is talking about emotional distress and difficult behaviors that we all go through to one degree or another. The ones who aren't diagnosed mentally ill are just the ones who haven't sought out help because they're afraid about this thing. And so hopefully, I think my podcast, the last podcast, was a solution to that for people, as to how to understand the issue outside of that medical model, outside of that, what I would argue is a moral model of judging people as bad people or wrong people or abnormal people. And none of us want to be bad, wrong, and abnormal.
Yeah, there's so many things you said there that I had planned on talking about. The morality piece of it is interesting. Also, what resonates with people. And what you just referred to, so I just want to let the listeners know, since the last time we spoke, you put all of these thoughts, some of which we talked about in the last episode, some of which we haven't, into a book. So it's called Smoke and Mirrors, How You Are Being Fooled About Mental Illness. And I imagine that's decades of your work, your thinking along these lines. Why did you feel now was the time to put it into, all of the things, what it is, what it's not, how to deal with it, into this book?
Well, it's been a long time coming. It just isn't just now I decided to write the book. I've been writing the book since about 2005. it went for some time and then started collecting dust, and then I worked on it some more, and then I put it off in the corner. And over time, in my experience in the profession demonstrated to me that some of the ideas that I had, and by the way, I'm not the first to think of these things. There's a lot before me that have written and talked about this main issue. But I started to become more comfortable being open and honest publicly about my views, because being in the profession and speaking negatively about the profession can be professionally dangerous.
Yeah.
And it has led to some people being fired, ostracized. I mean, those of us who are considered critical psychiatry, critical psychology people are always ostracized and demeaned and demonized and ad hominem attacks against us. But I just became, actually working one-on-one with people and seeing it in real life and not just in reading it. I became convinced of these views and felt more comfortable that I should, tell people about it. So this book was intended for consumers mainly. It was, the idea of us trying to battle the industry leaders. It's a weak one, because they have a lot of power, a lot of money, a lot of backing, and it's hard to really battle straight against the industry leaders or legislation through congressional representatives to try to change the system. It's probably would be more effective to go directly to the consumers and to try to explain to the consumers about these problems, because if they then quit buying the product, then the makers of that product will go bankrupt, hopefully. So that was a strategy of this book, was to target consumers about that. Once I got to the place where I was comfortable speaking up openly and publicly about it. Now, I'm in a private practice, so I don't rely as much on any kind of system as others do who are in universities or in agencies where they are required to work a certain way. I have the flexibility to do that, so that has helped me. And this is my second career, so it's not that, it's not that I'm just new to the world, the career world, and that mental health is my first career. It's not. So it gave me a more motivation, assertiveness to go forward with the project.
Something you said there made me think, because I struggle. So first of all, for those listening, and I'll say this in the intro, you're going to have to go listen to the first conversation with me and Chuck to catch up to here. If you don't, I think you will be very much behind on what happens next, because it is not the most commonly discussed topic. But the general thesis being that mental illness is not a thing. Now, meaning it's not a real illness. And I know I don't want to put words in your mouth, Chuck. Let me rephrase this. Chuck, give us the quick executive summary about the first part of the book, and therefore what we talked about in the last episode.
Basically, it's that, first off, the thing we call mental illness is very real. It does exist. It's a big problem. But it's not an illness. Not an illness, at least as most people understand illness. So illness, commonly known, is about something wrong with the person, something in the body or in the mind, or something is not working right. That is not true with mental illness. There's no evidence of any of that, despite more than a century, or more than 2 centuries now, of attempts to find some kind of scientific evidence that the problems like depression and schizophrenia and on have to do with something not working right in the body, some dysfunction in the person. So what the theme of the first part is, mental illness is not an illness, even though it's a big problem, but that the mental health industry has worked really hard to use language, pseudoscience, illogical reasoning to portray it as such. And it's even in the language. We're talking about what? Mental illness. Mm-hmm. But I'm saying mental illness isn't illness. So why is it called mental illness? The phrase itself even gives this false impression. So that's the first part of the book, is that it's not an illness, And I go through some historical accounts of how people dealt with the problem throughout the centuries and how it remains today. Some exploration of psychotherapy and its benefits, exploration of psychiatric drugs and what they do and what they don't do. Keeping in mind this non-medical model that I'm trying to present to people.
So again, for those listening, we're going to start off from there. And what I hope to do in this episode is talk more about, once you come to that realization, how can you change the way you live? How can you change the way you think? How can you help those that you love who are struggling with, whatever we call this? What do we call this now, by the way, if it's not mental illness?
Human problems.
Okay.
The part of the problem is we're looking for a word to call it. We already have words to describe it. It's sadness. It's responses to fear. It's just being human. So humans operate basically on I present it as like a three tiered, I guess you will, model of A, B, and C. Just think of A, B, and C. A is the context within which you live. So it includes everything you've done in your life up to this point, your history. It includes your current environmental circumstances, your financial settings, your social connection, everything up to this point. Now, in response to that, A, there's B, and B is the emotional reaction to that. So I might feel sad, or I might feel ashamed, or I might feel disgusted, or whatever the feeling is. I might also feel, by the way, excited and feeling joy and feeling proud and good feelings. But when the B, the emotion is bad, when it feels bad, when it hurts, we naturally try to get rid of that hurt. And that's C. So C is what we do to try to get rid of B. The solution is to try to focus on C, not B. So sadness and feeling shame, they aren't problems. They're not the problem. They're the answer. They're actually pointing at the answer. C can be the problem, and C includes things like depression and anxiety and schizophrenia and drinking and whatever, all the things that we do in an attempt to get rid of the bad feeling B. Right?
Yep.
But the B is meaningful. It tells us what's going on in our lives, even though it's hurtful. And if we have the willingness to tolerate B and kind of listen to it, then we can know what's going haywire in our lives. It's not what's going haywire in us. It's what's going haywire in our life, in our world. And then C might be something that can be done to eliminate B for good. Or we might find that B can't be eliminated. Like when someone dies, you can't eliminate the grief. It just is there, and it eventually subsides, but only when you ignore it in a way, or only when you tolerate it, you let it be. The more you fight against grief, the harder it is, the more painful it becomes. When you accept it, right, and everyone's aware of this process who's lost a loved one, when you accept the grief, paradoxically, it kind of fades away over time. When you fight against it, it gets stronger. So again, C is what we do, and I see mental illness, the diagnostic idea of mental disorders, mental illness categories, they're part of C, not B.
Right.
So we do anxiety, we do depression, and I think I mentioned this in the last podcast. I explained this idea. Depression doesn't happen to us. We don't get depression. We do it. And then we feel what it's like when we're doing it, which just adds back to be more painful feelings. And then we react to those increasing feelings with more depression, and on it goes. It spirals.
We did touch on it, but I don't know if we did so at the depth that is relevant. So walk me through perhaps that process and a real one, like, what is a common process that you see in your practice that follows that arc? Where, how does it start, and then what does it manifest into?
The recent pandemic and then the prior administration with President Trump and all that meant to people gives a good example of this, and I can think of particular people who are struggling with this. What happened, I think, now this started a long, long time ago, probably when television or radio was created, but it really took off in the last decade or so. And that is information being put out over Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and other platforms very easily worldwide. That's not true. So misinformation and disinformation. How do we know what's true when we read it is the big question. And a lot of people have trouble with that. So they tend to rely on, who do I trust? Do I trust this person? Do I trust that person to know what's true? Do I trust the media? Do I trust the president? That kind of thing. Rather than, and this is somewhat of an aside, but rather than learning how to think about something, so how to determine if something is probably true, rather than who to trust. But since there's a lot of people just trusting about what's true, they don't know for sure, and there's this kind of uncertainty going on, and they don't know, and so you see conspiracy theories grow, and real theories grow about problems in the world. Well, that uncertainty is because of, or it generates fear. Fear tends to generate anxiety. So in the face of that fear of uncertainty, B, so I just talked about A, the context. B is the fear and uncertainty. C is anxiety. And what that means is, in the face of this uncertainty, we naturally turn on our radar and we're looking in all directions for the threat. Threat meaning, what's real? You know, are the vaccines dangerous? Are they safe? Is the CDC being honest? Is the president stating the truth? Is the Washington Post reporting the truth? Those kinds of questions that really can't be answered really easily create a lot of fear. And so anxiety, we take on a very hyper-vigilant posture in our cognitive and physiological status and our posture itself in order to find out that answer. But we can never find out for sure. And so if our goal is to get certainty, we're stuck in this anxiety loop. And it just spirals upward, and it could cause panic attacks, psychosis, depending on how intense it is. We're constantly looking, and we're not finding the answer, but we're convinced there's a threat. So we keep looking, and we keep coming up with possibilities that make sense, but may not be true. But then we realize there's all kinds of possibilities that may be true. So which one do I pick? And we don't know how to decide on that. That's one example of what I've seen in private practice with people who would get diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, and the meaning of all of that gets ignored.
Wow, I appreciate that. So now that makes a little more sense if we do anxiety. So we have fear, we do things to lessen that fear. And essentially, would you say how much of it comes down to a want to go back to comfort or homeostasis? How much of this output we call mental illness is the inability to want to deal with uncomfortable thoughts and emotions?
Yeah, you're getting into a really controversial topic that I'd be glad to talk about, but it's the
Let's go.
difference between ability and willingness. They're not the same. Everyone has the ability to be willing. We all have that ability to be willing to do something. The question is, are we willing to do it? Right?
Got it.
Simple example. Someone who smokes cigarettes knows how to stop smoking. They have the ability to stop smoking, right? What does it take to stop smoking? Don't buy cigarettes.
Okay, wait. I'm going to cut you off. Here's why. I might edit this out of the interview, but this was a subject I really wanted to, if anything, I really wanted to talk about. It's probably the one of the primary things from your and I, our additional conversations that has stuck with me to this day, where I'll say, well, I don't want it because I'm not doing it. And if I really wanted it, I would do it. So anyways, I just wanted to stop because I'm so glad we're going here. Continue.
Okay. Right. Well, think about this. If you're in pain, who doesn't want the pain to go away? to go away, to find comfort, right? So if you're any kind of pain, emotional pain, physical pain, it's only natural that we try to get away from the pain. If you put your hand on a hot stove, you don't think, wow, my hand's on a hot stove and it is burning, I think I'll pick it up. You don't do that. You just automatically recoil from that. Same thing happens with emotional pain. It's a naturally uncomfortable feeling, so we want to be comforted. And so we try to get comfort by doing C, by doing something in an attempt to get comfort. Some things do provide comfort. So some of the C's are helpful. So if I'm sad, getting with a friend and talking about it does provide comfort. And there's not really any negative consequences of that. But if I'm sad and instead of getting with a friend, I go crawl in bed for days on end, I'm getting comfort, but it's an immediate sense of comfort that is fleeting. And it provides more pain to my life over time. I'm going to feel lethargic. I might feel guilty. I might lose a job. I might get, my wife might be upset with me. There's all kinds of things that come as consequences of staying in bed. In other words, doing depression. That just feed back into my desire to stay in bed even more. So yeah, I think it is a search for comfort, but I think that's just a natural thing. All organisms want comfort. Whether it's, humans are interesting because some of our comfort doesn't look comfortable because we're so individualized, and it's the meaning of what we do. So I might sacrifice something for my children. That provides me comfort, even though it's a sacrifice. That sounds paradoxical. People do a lot of things that are painful for comfort. So we're not just dogs. Dogs, if you hurt a dog, they feel pain, they try to get away from it. They don't think, well, I think I'll let myself be hurt here for the benefit of my master, that kind of thing. But we do that. We decide to do painful things and feel comfort in it because of it's helping, say, our children, or it's helping the world. That's what philanthropy is all about. Giving money away looks painful to people who don't have it, especially. But it actually provides comfort, knowing that you're helping.
So the question becomes, when you get to this realization that I can't blame my current state on a physical, identifiable illness. Okay, so it's mine to own. It's mine to deal with to an extent. And then we walk backwards from the idea we just talked about, which is ultimately this is an output of something I'm feeling. So if I'm feeling fear, I'm doing anxiety, I'm doing these things that are, well, there's one. How, if you're doing anxiety, the things you're doing are uncomfortable. So you're doing uncomfortable things to find comfort?
You're doing something to get immediate comfort, but it's fleeting. And then leads to discomfort, so you're back at B again, and you keep doing anxiety to try to get rid of that, but it causes more discomfort, so you're back to B again. It just keeps cycling.
Right.
So think of anxiety, I use this analogy in the book. Think of anxiety as treading water. In deep water, you're treading. If you've done that, you know how exhausting it is. And you're doing it just to breathe, but you got to keep doing it. So you feel comfort that you're breathing, but you're also getting exhausted, right? That's anxiety is like that. All you're doing is sitting still, maintaining this momentary sense of comfort of with anxiety, it's I'm prepared. I'm preparing for something. I'm guarding against something, even though you don't see it. And you don't even know what it is, but you're convinced it's out there. So you have your eyes open, your radar on, and everywhere. But obviously that's cognitively exhausting and physiologically exhausting too. That's why there's so many physiological components to anxiety.
Right.
So so there's a comfort, but it's fleeting, very fleeting, and leads to more discomfort. Those C's are problematic. There are C's that aren't like that. Like I said, talking to a friend. Right? Because you can do that over time, and you feel comforted, and you feel welcomed, and okay, things are going to be okay. Or talking to a therapist, perhaps, depending on the therapist. There's other, going for a walk, deciding to change your life in some way, eating better, exercising, structuring your life differently. There's all kinds of things you can do that do provide lasting comfort.
So, well, here's the thing, and this is one of the leftover remnants of, and still to this day, I think about probably on a weekly basis, knowing this. Like when you know this idea and you can own it, it doesn't make it better. In some senses, it actually makes it more difficult because now you're aware this is of my own doing, right? And so the thing about it is it's so ingrained. If it's gotten to this point where it's detrimental, extremely noticeable, maybe can be coined an illness, however we want to talk about it. It feels like it's such a part of you that it's not something you can change. It's not something you have control over. And that's where the division in my mind occurs, which is knowing this, but not feeling this, right? Knowing that I have control, but not feeling like I have control. What do you say to those people? Because I'm sure they're listening, right?
Well, we can talk about the feeling of being out of control. But it is, unless someone can present to me some kind of, some evidence that shows, or what is it that gets in the way of you putting the cigarette down? What is it that gets in the way that stops you, prevents you from putting that piece of pizza down? What is it that gets in the way of saying hello to someone? All these decisions we make in life, we have the ability to do otherwise. Nothing that I know of dictates or prevents action, including thought action. Now, I don't want this to sound like I'm saying it's easy to do otherwise, because it's not. And I also want to get rid of the concept of blame or fault. I'm not talking about someone being blameworthy, it's their own fault. That's, to me, that concept doesn't have any use other than to hurt people. But the reality is, when I used to smoke like a fiend, I had the ability to quit smoking, and I didn't realize that. I know this feeling of I don't have the ability, because I thought that when I was smoking. Like, I'm addicted, right? We have this nice word called addicted. And we argue over whether someone is addicted to something or not, as if there's some real way to determine the difference. All that word addicted means is I have an incredibly strong desire to do something, an urge to do something. In my case, it was smoking. And it's when I realized that I was smoking because I did not desire the consequences of not smoking. That's when I stopped smoking. It took a long time, though. It took about a year of constant struggle with that, of trying to convince myself whether it was really a problem to smoke or not. I fell for all of the things you hear about. When my grandmother smoked till she was 105 and didn't hurt her. So to me, that was evidence that smoking was fine. Well, I knew what it was doing to me. It wasn't that. I was in my, I guess I was in my 20s at the time, but it was hurting me. The after effect. The first drag, though, on the cigarette was wonderful. But the after effects of coughing and waking up and coughing things up, and that was just awful. And it stunk, and I burned up things. All the things that smokers deal with. It wasn't until I realized I had the ability. I just wasn't willing to put up with the crap that comes afterwards, understandably. That's when I stopped successfully.
Okay, so this makes sense, but what if you have rationalized that the behaviors you are doing are towards an outcome that you do want? So, as perhaps a poor example, but one many people can probably, align themselves with, I find that what I call anxiety really creeps up for me after weeks and weeks of extremely stressful work. And the reason is because what happens is I will work incessantly, obsessively. I will do it any free chance I get. I will think about it constantly with the goal of removing all future work. And what I mean is I'll work until theoretically at that moment, there's nothing left to do. And only then do I feel a pretty good sense of relief, right?
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, in today's day and age, you almost never get there. So what ends up happening is, you can imagine if you're staring at a computer for 10 hours straight, and you're just typing and you're just grinding or whatever you're doing, eventually the tension and the stress and the this and the that turns into a physical emotion, which then I'll go, oh, this is obviously, right? The problem is, I have convinced myself that that is what's required for me to get to where I want to go, right? So the reason I tell that story is I have told myself, and I don't know right or wrong, that the things causing the unpleasant emotions are also being done on purpose for a purposeful outcome. How do we separate the two? The behaviors that are causing the emotion that I want to go away are also the things causing the result that I want.
Yeah, but you know what you want.
So,
Do you have an end goal in mind? Can you state it? I'm really, my understanding of what you said is that
right.
there's a sense that one day you'll be done with the journey, and then you can relax.
Right.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
What is
Yeah,
that?
so like, well, for me, I mean, it's at the moment what's happening, right? Is, 2 podcasts, full-time job, things trying to do on the side, family, all these things, right? Now, why work on all these things constantly? At night, I mean, whatever. And it's because I don't want to have to do work anymore, right? I don't want to have to do those things. So the behaviors, the constant speed towards execution is with the goal of not having to do that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But it has this secondary effect.
That's a traditional idea of retirement, right?
That's why I'm using this example.
Well, many people dream of that day when we can we've arrived. Oh, and I can sit back and retire and relax. But what they find out when they get there, they're bored to death.
Right.
Well, life doesn't seem like it's worth anything anymore. There's nothing they're working toward. There's nothing they're interested in because they've done it all. For many people, I'm not saying all people. So I mean that would be an interesting conversation that we probably can't have here.
Right.
But of exploring that idea of that goal of yours to get someplace, to get to the end of the journey so you can relax instead of realizing that the whole thing is a journey. I don't think we get to the end of the journey until we die. And then maybe even after that, depending on your religious views, it may not be over still. So,
you know why that makes sense, though, Chuck? The reason I use the example is because what I wanted to get to, and I only really know my own experiences, so I'm going to ask you, but is, the reason we do these things that we deem extremely uncomfortable to the point where many people call it an illness is real. The reason we do the things is real.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is, are you stopping to uncover why you do them in the first place? Is that where you start? Like, where would you have people start if they're trying to deal with a perceived mental illness, what we call mental illness?
Well, I try to get them to think in terms of that simple model I presented, the ABC model, and to focus on B. So let's take depression. So there's usually a sadness of some sort, disappointment in life, maybe disappointment about a specific thing or event. And in response to that painful feeling, we typically recoil from life or start sort of a passive strategy in life. We just shut down. That's why you see people stay in bed and they reject social invitations. They just don't do anything that used to make them feel good before. They don't watch shows that they like. They don't read it. Whatever it is they liked to do, they don't see the purpose in that. because life seems so disappointing. They just shut down and be passive, like the ostrich with its head in the sand, in an attempt to make that disappointment of life go away. But that disappointment in life is really meaningful. It's saying something about your life. And so what I would try to do is get them to back up to be and explore that more. What is disappointing? Are there specific things? Is it your marriage? Is it your job? Is it the way you are? It may be an existential thing. You know, you've often heard
Right.
people wonder, why are we doing this anyways? Why are you and I here talking right now? Why are the listeners listening? We're all going to end within a few decades, really. And if we just broaden our time view, the whole solar system is going to get burned up in a few billion years. So what's this all about? I mean, even the most impactful people, from Plato and Aristotle to George Washington and other leaders in the world that are well known, they're going to be forgotten at some point. All they did, all we do, all everyone does is just going to be burned up and thrown away. So why are we doing this? That realization brings a lot of sadness and a lot of disappointment. But if you don't pay attention to it and explore it more, it can lead to you just going depression. You know, nothing's worth it. I'm just going to stay in bed. I don't care. That kind of an attitude, that's depression happening. But many people can realize that disappointment in life and still go forward and find a meaningful life in the time that they have left. But you have to
How do they do that?
Disappointment. Gosh, I don't know. How do I do it, or how does one do it?
Well, that's a good point. So you have to be willing to feel the disappointment. Tell me why.
I said that if you are willing, you can avoid the passivity, the depression. Instead of responding to this disappointment and depression, you can respond to it by paying attention to it and exploring it and wondering about it and coming up with different ideas of how to deal with it. You can do that. I'm not saying you have to.
Right.
You might be willing to.
Okay.
That's an alternative than depression. Is
I
to be
see.
willing to face it, to deal with it, to live it, to talk to others about it. I don't mean necessarily therapists, but bring people into your life and share this real problem, this existential problem. But even the less existential problems can be done that way too.
When people come to you, right, and they let's say in this example, how do you help them explore it? What do you find are the useful things that allow people to perhaps move beyond what we might call doing depression or doing anxiety into doing things that, although they might not solve the issue, allow it to be more productive? I don't know what the word would be there.
Well, I think you're asking me, like, what techniques do I use?
What's your thought process? Because really what I'm asking is, let's say somebody is doing this on their own at home, right? They've gotten past the point of, okay, it's not an illness, so I don't need a pill to fix it. I can fix it. I have the ability to fix it, right? Where can they start? How can they start? Because the reason I'm asking you is they could come to you and you'll help them start, or they could try and do it on their own. But if we get to the theory behind it, maybe they can try some things first.
Well, we've been talking about the theory behind it.
Right.
It's basically how humans react to emotional pain. That is what it comes down to. How do we react to emotional pain, both in thought and in behavior? So the emotions, we can't choose emotions. They happen based on what we perceive in the world. They're just connected. If we perceive a loss, we feel sadness. If we perceive a threat, we feel fear. They go together. So if we listen to the emotion, we have some idea of what's meaningfully going on right now. We can choose how to think about it, and we can choose how to act in response to it. Although it's incredibly difficult to do that. I mean, I use the smoking example a lot because it's a really simple thing, a really relatively minor problem that is incredibly difficult to do. But we know how to do it. We know what to do in response. I know how to say, smoking does increase my risk of heart disease. I know how to think that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'd have to be willing to think that at the moment I light up. I know how to throw away a pack of cigarettes. I know how to not buy cigarettes. I know those things. I have to be willing to do those things. So it's not really, there's not really a technique. I mean, I find that a lot of times people come to us looking for some way around this reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Looking for some trick or it's like the diet industry, right? All diet industry products fail because they're avoiding the reality of lifelong eating habits. They're all temporarily oriented, really. I don't know of anyone that stays on any diet plan for the rest of their lives. I'm sure there's somebody, but I don't know many.
Mm-hmm.
It's because they never address this real problem with eating, and that is, how do you use food? What do you use it for? How much do you eat? Why do you eat? Those kinds of things for the rest of your life, not so that I can fit into my bikini by summertime. That's typically how eating problems are looked at. It's a temporary thing. There's no way around that. There's no diet, there's no technique, there's no therapy that can help people avoid these really difficult dilemmas in life of what to do about this emotional pain, whether it's the realization of death or whether it's stopping smoking. There's no trick, right?
Right.
There's no like hypnotic kind of thing I can do to you to make it easier for you. And that's what many people, I think maybe most people, are really looking for that. I want this to be easier, but what they find out, at least when they work with me, is it's harder.
Right.
Because I do emphasize this idea that the burden is on your shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
You have the ability, you have to think about your willingness to put up with and tolerate the consequences of doing certain things. And obviously, being with others does help. Learning about things does help. But it comes down, most of these problems comes down really to a decision or decisions that are very, very difficult to make.
At the core of this, I think is something we touched on, but I wanted to get into it more, which is, you're calling it willingness. I really like the simplicity of the word want. I know you and I talked many times, and when that word would come up, you would almost flag it. Almost always flag it. And it stuck with me. So many people listening will say things like, I want to quit smoking, I just can't. Or I want to feel this way. I want to not do this. And one of the hardest things for me to grasp is essentially, well, let me rephrase this. So this idea of want, you would often say, you don't want to. If you wanted to, you would do it. Explain that to me.
Well, this is a problem with our ability to think. Humans, we have this self-reflexive ability. We can think about thinking, and we can sort of parse reality out into little boxes and only live in one box and ignore the rest of the boxes and things like that. And that's what's happening here. So I understand. And I say this too in colloquial language. I want to, whatever. I want to go mow the grass. But I'm sitting here not mowing the grass. What that's saying is, I have a desire for that grass to be mown, but I'm not paying attention to all the things that go into mowing it when I say I want to mow it. I want to quit smoking, but I'm not paying attention to the fact that quitting is incredibly painful and difficult. I'm looking at just this one little piece. It's like, think of life as a big jigsaw puzzle. And I'm looking at one piece, and I just want that one piece. I don't want all the pieces that touch it, though. And you can't do that in life. When you pull the one piece, the rest of the puzzle comes with it. When we say, I want to, but I can't, that's what we're doing. We're saying, I want to, in a fantasy world kind of way. I want to write a book, and then I don't write one. Why? It's incredibly difficult to write a book, it turns out. A lot harder than I thought it was going to be. So I told you, started writing the book in 2005, and it took until 2020 to publish it. So, 15 years of just this, gosh, back and forth until whatever happened, it led to the final result.
Mm-hmm.
My point is that life, you can't take pieces of life. You have to take everything that touches that piece, and then everything that touches those pieces. When you're thinking of, in terms of what you desire, think that way. What do I desire, given the way the world works? So I desire this, recognizing it comes with this, and I also desire that stuff too. When you can say that, then you'll stop or start whatever you're saying you desire. If you can think about it that way, that it comes as a package. It's like Verizon. I have Verizon here in my house. I really only need the internet, but I have phone and cable TV and something else. Anyways, if I get rid of those and only keep the internet service, my price goes up. So it comes in a package. Like, to get internet, I have to have phone. I can't get one or the other, one without the other. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes great sense. I've never even thought of it put the way of, well, let me ask you this. What is the harm in thinking about wants in terms of output without thinking about the input and reality that goes into it?
Nothing, as long as you're willing, or as long as you recognize that's what you're doing. We say all kinds of things. For instance, I say, gosh, I have to get up and go take care of that, right? Something like that. I really don't have to. There's no cosmic requirement. There's no rule, some law, or somebody's going to come arrest me if I don't do this. But I realize I don't mean that literally when I say I have to, or I must, or I should. It's just colloquial. We just talk that way. It's the way so we say the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and we all agree on that, right? Even though that's not true. The sun doesn't rise up and down. But we use that in a colloquial sense just to get along in life, to coordinate our actions. And we say things like, I have to do this, I want to do that. In the same way, we get into trouble when we think that's literal. And we get into these quandaries about, why can't I just quit smoking? That's not even true, though, that I can't quit. I can quit. I just don't want to.
Right.
That's where the language gets us into trouble, is we think it's literal. We confuse the words we use with the reality we live in, and they're not the same.
So this, I feel like, wraps so much into what we were talking about as it relates to extreme emotions. And I don't know, look, maybe I'm asking the same question 6 ways, and I don't know if I'm going to get an answer on it, but I'm going to keep trying, which is, when people feel these extreme emotions, let's say they have now been opened up to reality, right? It's within their control. How do we get people to recognize? Well, let me rephrase that. Let's say people know they're struggling with something. How do we get them to recognize the things they're doing that are not helpful? How do we get them to recognize their patterns and their, the root cause of an issue, when so many are going to doctors asking them to tell them the root cause of the issue and they're not getting it? They're getting a pill or they're getting a diagnosis. I
don't know. Again, I don't know what, other than what we're trying to do to spread this word about this charade, as I would call it, that these things are illnesses to be treated by medical professionals in medical ways and thought about as symptoms and a diagnosis and treatment and prognosis and all of that kind of stuff. That clearly doesn't have any kind of justification other than if we just want to redefine what illness means. So if we want to say, and by the way, many people within the field of psychiatry and clinical psychology have done this. Illness is any kind of sense of unease, any kind of sense of unwell. That's why it's ill, right? It's a feeling. It's not necessarily a disease. So there's a separation between the idea of disease versus illness. Disease is something that happens, something goes wrong with the person. Illness is what we feel. So if I'm struggling with my life, and I think I've come to a place where, I didn't expect to be here this time in my life. I expected to be further on in my life and make more money, whatever it is, have better relationships, whatever's missing, right? That is a bad feeling. But is that an illness, despite any kind of lack of disease process in the body? Would that still be considered a medically conceived illness for medical professionals to assess and treat? That's a judgment call. That's just a subjective judgment call about what we value in terms of what we want to call an illness and hand over to the medical profession to help us. I don't see why a medical professional, though, or how a medical professional would have any kind of expertise to deal with that, because that's not there's not a scientific thing about that.
Right.
That's a personal sense and about personal values and desires and so forth. Well, unless we change the definition of illness, don't go to a medical doctor to deal with these problems. They're just, what they're going to do is either drug you or try to cajole you into some sort of what's called healthy living. It really isn't about healthy living. It's really about you shutting up about your problems and looking like you're happy, so we're all better. We feel better about it because you're not complaining anymore.
Well, so it makes sense. And again, you talk about this a lot in your book. We talked about it in the last episode that, the various names we give these extreme emotions, or the behaviors we do because of these extreme emotions, then become diagnoses. But if the common names we know them by aren't what they actually are, how do you, or help us define the experience so those who have it can identify it more easily? So, for example, I think you did a pretty good job with anxiety. Maybe you might want to touch on it, but I'd love to hear maybe, the top 4 that we see. Maybe it's anxiety, depression, I don't know, bipolar, schizophrenia. How do you see those actually, as opposed to a medical diagnosis?
Now, this is in the second half of the book. I do actually touch on those 4, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. And each of them, I already talked about anxiety and depression. Anxiety and depression are like opposite reactions to the same painful emotion, to emotional pain, not the same emotion. One is taking on a strategy of passivity with depression in order to attempt to get rid of the sadness in life, disappointment in life. The other, anxiety, is an attempt to take on the opposite, a very active and hypervigilant strategy in order to defend or guard or protect against perceived threats in life. Neither one of them work except in the immediate term. So it feels good to jump in bed and pull the covers over your head, but then that quickly goes away. You can fall asleep, but you wake back up and there's your life still waiting for you, and now you feel even worse for having done that. With anxiety, take on a hypervigilant posture, and you get this treading water feeling, like I'm taking care of this, I'm protecting against this, even though I'm not moving away from the deep end. I'm just sitting in the deep end treading water. And because anxiety overwhelms your attentional capacity, you're trying to think of so many things at once, you tend to make mistakes. So you forget where you left your keys, and you forget an appointment. You forget someone's name because you're doing anxiety while they're introducing themselves. And so those provide more fear, realization that, oh my God, I can't remember that word. Maybe I have dementia. And it just spirals up instead of down like in depression. With schizophrenia, it's sort of like taking on, it's in the face of this overwhelming emotional pain in life, and this is chronic. I'm not talking about acute moments of pain. This is ongoing stuff. We start wondering whether we're viewing the world right. And we start considering different ideas. Well, maybe the world isn't this way that I thought it was, it's this way. We start taking on a new reality or considering it. And depending on how isolated we are from others, that can really grow with a person. to the point that hallucinations, what we call delusions, develop. Because you're with yourself so long and you're thinking so much about things, you know as well as I do, we can hear our thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
If you do that constantly in the face of a lot of trauma and pain in your life, that can develop into what we see and what we end up calling schizophrenia. Now, the diagnosis of schizophrenia is really loose. I've seen all kinds of people diagnosed with schizophrenia, and it doesn't make any sense even when looking at the industry standards. With bipolar disorder, I see bipolar disorder as a strategy of trying to, how could I put this, refusing to live within biological and social limits.
Mm.
It's basically a refusal to let excitement go away. So when we do things that are exciting, when you're doing your work and you feel really good about it,
Mm-hmm.
it feels good. So we keep doing it. But the problem is we're humans and we have limitations, both biological and social. So we need sleep, for example. If you don't have sleep, you're going to cause all kinds of problems down the road. We have money in our society, and when you spend money, you get things. But if you keep spending money and get things, which feels good, you end up going bankrupt or having problems there. Everything is like that in life. We have exciting things to do, and if we refuse to say, okay, it's time to stop doing this exciting thing, basically, and I'll start back up tomorrow. If we don't do that, if we just keep it going, trying to keep it going and keeping it going, we end up doing things that you either get burned out biologically, or you get arrested, or you go bankrupt, or you piss off a lot of people, and you get labeled bipolar. Because you're trying to make that manic thing go forever, but it's going to come down. And when you hit that peak, you come crashing down, and the sense is, nothing's worth it. I've tried my best and it doesn't work. The hell with it all. Then you're down into the depression part and you take on that passive strategy. But then something piques your interest at some point and it goes back up. And instead of realizing that life is kind of like in the middle, with these sometimes really high peaks and high lows, but most of the time it's hovering around the middle somewhere. That's boring for a lot of people. Life has to be something, amazing, fantastic. And I'm going to find it. That's the bipolar strategy. So that's how I define, or how I describe those four. And I would be able to take any of the diagnostic categories and describe it in that kind of way. Each broad diagnostic category has its own theme of strategy on how to get rid of a painful emotion. Whether it's fear, disgust, shame, sadness, whatever it is.
I'm glad you brought up that idea. For those who can't watch us but hear us, the wave. What is that, like a sine wave? Is that what the...
It's just up and down, yeah. Things go up and down, right.
Imagine like a sine wave. You mentioned that to me once in a conversation, and I find it comforting. And I've heard it in different ways to recognize that the highs are as temporary as the lows to an extent. But I remember you saying I know it's funny talking to you now because I know I go, well, Chuck's going to correct this language, but you can correct it, right? Meaning the words matter. I remember you saying, but try to keep it from getting out of that normal wave, right? When you seek for the ups to keep going, you get into that kind of manic stage. When you keep when you have the lows keep going, you get into that depressive stage. I found that to be a useful mechanism for recognizing emotions as temporary and fleeting, and then allowing almost a cosmic understanding that there will be a tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know why that would help, though.
Why it would help?
It does, but why does it help? Why does it help deal with extreme emotions?
Well, it I guess provides a roadmap for you as you're living your life. That when it's 11 o'clock at night and you're on a roll with some project, to say, whoa, wait a minute, it's 11 o'clock at night. I got to get up at 6 tomorrow, right? Time to go to bed. So if I stay up till 3 working on the project, And then I don't even think 3 is good enough, so I'll stay up to 6, and I'll say, well, the hell with it. I'll just stay up all night and just, right? I mean, we used to do that in college. We just stay up all night and
Hmm.
cram for an exam. That isn't helpful to do that, to exceed those limits. So it's just keeping these limits in mind is what I'm suggesting. There are biological and social limits. You piss off people if you do things too much, right?
Right.
You go bankrupt if you spend too much money. You have sleep deprivation psychosis if you don't sleep for a few days. There are things that will happen that aren't going to be fun for you if you don't pay attention and abide in some way by these limits.
In talking to you, one of the analogies I can't get out of my head is this idea that we are all living in a game that has rules, and recognizing you have to play by these rules, or you will play by the rules. There's no way around it. In some sense, helps, and in the other, adds to that existential dread because you might disagree with those rules. Have you ever thought about it that way?
Yeah, there is no way to work outside the rules. One way or another, you're going to be subjected to those rules. You could
Right.
do it voluntarily, or you can have it happen involuntarily. We see this in addictions, right? That's the whole idea about addictions. All addictive things feel good, right? So it's food, drugs, alcohol, sex, right?
Right.
They feel good. They're supposed to feel good. That's what life is like. So the addiction occurs when we just want to keep it going. Keep eating, keep drinking, constant sex, whatever the thing that feels good, we just want to keep it going indefinitely. And you know what happens in every one of those situations. If you, at some point, you'll crash. You'll get arrested, you'll crash, you'll do something that's going to force the consequences upon you.
That doesn't make me feel better necessarily. Not that that was your goal, but it's a little stressful. So there's a couple of things I wanted to ask you. What advice would you give to somebody who wants to help others, who wants to, recognize the pain or the struggles that people are experiencing, but doesn't want to go into psychiatry, and also doesn't want people to feel like they're denying their feelings, right? Because if you go and say it's not an illness. So I guess ultimately it's, how do we help those around us if we recognize this, if we believe this, but it's not what the world at large is perpetrating?
You mean, how does someone get into a profession of helping without being a psychologist, psychiatrist, clinical person?
No, just on a general, right? It could be professional, it could not, right? Maybe it's my child, maybe it's my spouse, maybe it's,
Well, it's I guess is what I've been saying is that it's important to, I guess we would call it validating the emotion that someone's having. But what we're basically doing is we're explaining that the emotion you're experiencing is not the problem. It's okay. You're human. You're experiencing this emotion. Listen to it. Pay attention to it. What is it saying? Because any emotion is always saying something. Again, sadness says there's a loss. That group of emotions, sadness, disappointment, despair, that kind of thing, usually means there's some kind of loss, something you don't have that you want or something you had that you lost. Fear, obviously, is about something that might be threatening the person. Now, it can be all kinds of threats, everything from a lion to self-esteem threats, right? Shame tells you that there was something you were just doing very pridefully, and then the rug was pulled out from underneath you, and you realized that that's not how people see that thing. So we feel that thing of shame or guilt or embarrassment. So every emotion has a meaning behind it. And so if our goal, which unfortunately the mainstream industry's goal is to eliminate emotion, that's what psychiatric drugs do. They prevent the brain from doing what it naturally does that we experience as an emotion. So if you don't feel emotions as much or not at all, depending on the dosage you're getting, then you're not going to respond to that painful feeling. That's the whole idea behind psychiatric drugs. and by the way, electroshock therapy and some other forms of psychiatric treatment, is to make the feeling itself, the B and the ABC model, to make that numb so you don't notice it. So if I don't feel sad, then I'm not going to recoil in depression. And so when we see people given drugs like that and they don't endorse the symptoms of depression, we say that's an effective treatment. But what do we do? It's really human engineering. We're preventing you from feeling what it's like to be human. Now you don't complain about that, obviously, because you don't feel the problem, and we say that's effective treatment. Well, we're not treating anything. We're just preventing you from feeling, right? And feeling is where meaning resides. It doesn't reside anywhere else. So
That's what I was going to ask. Yeah.
When you get rid of the feeling, what is motivating you? What's driving your life? There's little or none driving your life anymore, depending, again, on the dosage. Some dosages aren't going to have that big of an effect. And I mean, we know from research that most psychiatric drug effectiveness is because of placebo effect. So, there may be a little bit of effect of taking a drug for some people at lower doses, that kind of thing. But that's how it works. It doesn't correct some chemical imbalance. It doesn't correct something deficient in the body or in the brain. It just deadens your ability to feel emotion. That's it. The stimulant drugs like Ritalin, they increase your ability. They increase central nervous system activity, so they provide the excitement to pay attention to something. And it would work with anybody. It's no different than my coffee every morning. I have my coffee and I can think really sharply, but at my age, that goes away somewhere around 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 4 o'clock. Yeah. I'm not going to keep drinking coffee to get that back, because then I won't sleep. Right. There's other problems associated with that. But that's how the drugs work, is they artificially, unnaturally interfere. They actually create a chemical imbalance in the brain. They create a chemical composition that isn't there naturally, so that you won't feel, or you will feel, things that you didn't originally, naturally.
Well, and I think the argument, and we tackled this in episode 1, not maybe at length, is what if the people who need them, let's say need them, their chemical imbalance is there to begin with, and these drugs actually bring it to a better average equilibrium.
Yeah, but that's not true. People can believe that, but It's not true. There's a lot of things people believe that aren't true.
Right.
In this chemical imbalance theory it's almost absurd, because the leaders in the conventional field, just yesterday I saw another article written by Ronald Pies, Pies. He, since 2010 or so, he's been saying that, hey, listen, we've never marketed this idea of a chemical imbalance for mental illness. No well-reasoned and educated psychiatrist has ever thought that, and has ever told that to anybody. That's frankly just BS.
Yeah.
To this day, if you go on APA's website, it says right in there that it's thought to be due to chemical changes in the brain, blah, 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 things like that. They've sort of come away from the term imbalance. They don't say that anymore, but they do say it's thought that chemical, I don't know if they say changes, there's another word they use, but it kind of softened it up, but they're still saying that. And frankly, if you go to a psychiatrist and get a prescription today, that's exactly what they'll tell you. If you ask them, why am I taking this? They'll say, well, it's going to correct a chemical imbalance in your brain. So even though the leaders of the field, and it's not just Dr. Pies, it's many, many people say, this is ridiculous, this complaint against us for perpetuating this chemical imbalance theory is silly. It's bizarre, because they still do it constantly. It just isn't true. There's no evidence of any kind of chemical imbalance that's causing these problems. There are chemical changes, and I know we got into this at the last episode, and it's a long conversation, but there are clearly chemical changes occurring in the brain when people are doing depression or anxiety, but there are chemical changes in the brain when we do anything. You and I are causing chemical changes to occur, but that doesn't make what we're doing an illness.
Right.
It's because there's some kind of chemical change going on.
I can't. I can't let this go without asking because let's go back to the analogy of we're in a game where there's rules. If we can take a PED, right, a performance enhancing drug that allows us to circumvent some of those rules, what is the necessary harm? Because,
Nothing.
okay, go ahead.
No, I mean, there could be, I guess there could be a chemical harm depending on the drug itself, right?
Right.
But I think you're asking me, what's wrong with that,
Yeah.
right? Nothing. I don't care if someone decides to do that. What I care about is that it's not portrayed that way to people who are taking psychiatric drugs. They're not being told, listen, nothing's wrong with your brain. You're experiencing a natural human problem. And if you want, I can give you this drug so you won't notice that problem. But it's basically a performance enhancing drug. It's not correcting anything in your body. I have no problem with that. I'm not an anti-drug person. I'm an advocate for legalizing drugs and kind of getting rid of some prescription privilege issues. It's the informed consent part that troubles me, is that we the population are being lied to, convinced that we have a chemical imbalance and an illness in our brain usually, and that if you take this drug it'll correct it and you'll be cured of depression. And that's false. All of that is false. It
I
might
remember,
help.
yeah.
And
Go
if
ahead.
you find it helpful, go for it. I don't care about that.
Well, and I remember touching on that in the first episode, but not to this extent. What I love about that is imagine the first time somebody goes to a psychiatrist, a doctor, with one of these extreme emotions. And the doctor says, you can either try to solve this, try to experience this, and work through it, or you can take this drug, which will allow you to no longer feel it. You pick. That's a much different choice.
Bravo.
Much different
Yeah.
choice. Because oftentimes it's framed as you have this happening and this will help. That's it. No context. I don't even think it's always you have a chemical imbalance. It's just you have this problem. This will help. The same way you have a herniated disc, this Advil will help. Right? But when you frame it that way, you at least allow people to ask themselves, is this something I want to deal with and work on? Or is it something I want to ignore?
Exactly. Yeah. I'm all for that.
That's fascinating.
It's like I'm all for people who want to smoke cigarettes. It's up to them. I don't want to be around them because I can't stand the smell, but
Right.
that's them. They get to choose that. And we all get to choose how we deal with the problems in our lives. If we decide to go stop at the local bar and have a few shots to calm down, great. But don't think that you're treating an illness by doing that. If
Right.
you want to smoke weed, fine, go do it, whether it's medical or not, which that's another issue. It's kind of silly, but yeah, we all have this, we're all stuck with a decision. We have to decide what to do in our lives and how to do it. And there's all kinds of ways to deal with sadness in life, right? There's all kinds of ways to do it. We get to decide, but the problem is when we're lied to or when we're fed, it's almost like we're not lied to directly. It's just this system is built on this grand assumption that everyone accepts, most people accept, and it's not true at all.
How much of the assumption is is a function of necessity for the system to perpetuate? Because let's assume we snap our fingers and everybody says, there's nothing physiologically wrong with you. This is an extreme emotion. It is very troubling, but there is nothing physiologically wrong with you. Now, all of a sudden, does it become a lot more difficult to justify being a psychiatrist, for example?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it is a threat to the professions. Mine too. My profession is psychology, clinical. I was trained as a clinical psychologist, but the profession of psychology is threatened by this view. And psychiatry and clinical social work and clinical counseling, they're all threatened by this view. In a way, I realize I'm shooting myself in the foot by doing this, but I think it's important enough to portray it this way, to portray
But
it the way it is.
how are psychologists impacted? See, the reason I get confused is if it is a struggle of the mind, then I would definitely want to go to somebody who can help me deal with the struggle of the mind, which would, in my mind, be a psychologist or a social worker or a coach or whatever.
But there's really, regarding that struggle of the mind, all those professions, that's all those professions' bailiwick.
Right. Except psychiatry.
No, psychiatry's taking that on. I mean, there's an article in, Psychiatric Times yesterday, I think it was, that psychiatry is now looking at the misinformation and disinformation problem that we talked about earlier today, and thinking of it in terms of an immunological problem. And they're calling, yeah, right.
What?
That they're looking at it with a medical model to help people think correctly. And the reason they don't think correctly is they're infected with, and this is true, this is in the article, parasites of the mind. And these parasites are, I don't know, it's another kind of ghostly idea that there are these parasites of the mind that prevent you from thinking correctly and critically. And so it's a matter for psychiatry to handle. I was astounded at that.
You have to be kidding me.
It's called cognitive immunology, I think is the phrase. Yeah, so but that's psychiatry, but the other mental health professions are kind of scooping up problems in living. No, disinformation, misinformation, that's a problem. Politics is a problem. Economics, they're all problems, but the mental health industry is trying to scoop up all of them as problems and calling them illnesses, or at least seeing them through a medical model for a medical approach to dealing with them. Yeah, parasites of the mind. Now, if that were metaphorical, I understand, but we're not good. Our profession is not good at keeping metaphor and literal concepts apart.
Right.
We mix them together and confuse people.
Right.
Yeah, so that's scary, and it portends as some, what's going to come. We're going to see more. We're going to see diagnoses now, I'm sure, in the next revision of the DSM that includes some kind of mind parasite or, misinformation disorder or things like that.
Right. Wow. Well, at least we've got people like you out there fighting the good fight, Chuck. I have to say, over our conversations, you have definitely changed my perspective on it to one that is much more about ownership. And like where we started, I don't think it makes it easier. I just feel like it makes it empowered or right, just correct.
Harder.
Yeah.
And again, I want to emphasize, because I get criticized for this. I'm not saying mental illness doesn't exist. I'm saying it's not an illness.
Right.
I'm not saying it's easy to do differently. It's incredibly hard to do differently, and actually the approach that I'm advocating makes it even harder to do differently. It's not an easy thing to do, but it is many times a simple thing, like smoking, stopping smoking. It's pretty simple, straightforward. It's just damn hard to do it.
Yeah.
I don't want to confuse people I'm saying, and I don't want to make people think that it's their fault, because I'm not talking about fault or blame. Right. I'm just saying it is your decisions that will change the course for you. It's deciding differently, it's thinking differently and acting differently, doing differently in the face of these existential realities we are faced in life.
Well, Chuck, first of all, thank you so much for being back on the show. For those listening who want to dig in, who have not gotten enough out of our, at this point, close to 3 hours of Smart People podcast, there is so much more. Extremely well written in the book, Smoke and Mirrors, How You Are Being Fooled About Mental Illness. An insider's warning to consumers. I like it, Chuck. I like it.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Chuck, anywhere you want people to go outside of, we'll link to the book, but, or are you just kind of back in your world doing what you do?
I am in my world doing what I do, and if they want to, they can go to my website. It's just a brief overview of how I see things, and the website is chuckruby.com. They can also go to the website of a nonprofit that I'm the executive director of. It's the International Society for Ethical Psychology and Psychiatry, and the website is psychintegrity.org or isepp.com, isepp.com. And there you can read about some of the things we're trying to do. Basically, ISEP is it's an attempt to get the conversation going along these lines, to try to get the word out to consumers and to try to change the mental health field in some way to make it more humane, more helpful, less harmful to people.
I love it. We will link to that, Chuck. Thanks again.
Anytime.